Hi all, welcome to week 7. We're going to discuss marriage, residency patterns, kinship, um, and some of the kind of family life things among culture groups. So some of the key concepts that you're definitely going to want to know, and putting this into context and in terms of cultures around the world. Um, in some places, and especially in band level societies, mothers and women had a lot of power, and a lot of their power came from the kinship structure. So this would have offset, in terms of the status structure in egalitarian societies, would have offset some of maybe male kind of physical uh, prowess and or strength and some of those things. So ultimately, the family ties through the mother's line becomes a big source of their power. Uh, Women have higher status where matrilineal descent and matrilocal residences are the norms. Matrilineal descent means that you trace your lineage through your mother only. So obviously we don't have that. We take our father's name. However, we stay connected to our relatives on both sides of the family. So we're bilateral descent. This is matrilineal. And then matrilocal means that you live close to your mother's family. So it's all through the wife or the mom. Women kin relationships, that is wife, sisters, mothers, create the power web of this structure. Excuse me, I'm trying not to sneeze. The Masuo of the Himalayan highlands in China households are comprised of brothers and sisters who live together for life. This is a fascinating way of dividing people. And they divide tasks like raising children. Their sexual partners are not involved in raising the children or around at all. So their sexual partners would be outside of the kinship group. They would basically utilize that structure for reproduction purposes only. So again, brothers and sisters end up living together and raising their children when they get to be of age. This is a very different system than we have. But remember, maintain cultural relativity. If you are born in this system is normal to you, just like our system is normal to us. Women use kinship as a form of power. I touched on this prior. I don't know that necessarily that women, I phrased the sentence maybe a little bit wrong. It's not that they use kinship for power, it's that kinship provides power for women. The structures kind of exist for that reason. Unmarried women in Tibet either are ordained a nun or live separate in a separate house but maintain ties with the family. Working poor tend to combine efforts, and money becomes more communistic in these kinds of structures. Kin matters and is the foundation for sharing survival practice. So this is really, when we look at kinship, we're looking at kinship studies, by the way, from Morgan on, were very, up until more recently people have more focused on social networking theory as kinship starts to fade and families become kind of less important to individuals in societies, especially developed societies, and where we become more separate from our families. But kinship studies were very, very important in terms of not only like the language used, but also the structure of your band level society was totally dependent on your kin and what the kinship structure looked like. Poverty, racial segregation, and spatial isolation isolate and disconnect households. And this is more to do with, again, developed nations. Poverty didn't exist in band level societies. It wasn't a class division, right? So we also have racial segregation. So this is definitely much more of a American kind of concept around race and spatial isolation. Keeping children safe is the primary goal of parents. Family is the key to survival and provides transportation, housing, food, job, and leads to emotional health. This has a lot to do with the oxytocin kind of concept, which is human touch and or connectedness, which is a hormone that is released during this kind of process of socializing with your group. This is what the kinship symbols look like. So if you ever see kind of a kinship tree or a kinship diagram, males are represented by triangles, females by circle. Marriage is the equal sign, divorce is a slash through it. Sexual relations is just a line. Again, if we were talking about the people of Tibet that stay with their kinship group, the sexual relation line is important to diagram out, but again, it doesn't show, it's not showing marriage or kind of the connectivity to the kinship structure. Descent is a straight line down, sibling tie is the over, and then deceased is a line through it. Again, this is another one, kind of showing you also what it looks like on a kinship diagram with those symbols that I just gave you. Ego is usually marked out by a square. So again, kind of having a center point and then mapping that out in terms of your relatives is what the kinship tree looks like. Societal influence. So if we look at matriarchal societies or patriarchal societies, remember matriarchal tends to be female side. Patriarchal is male side. So matriarchal societies are more in the early side of things, band level societies, female deities, female power base, inheritance through the female. Parallel descent is more to do with like inheritance, and this gets into more modern era. What we find in patriarchal societies is agriculture societies, male power base, male deities, and then the inheritance is through the male line. So you have matriarchal, patriarchal, and then you have parallel descent, which is much more kind of what we have currently. We made a big flip in terms of just passing it down to the oldest son, which is kind of European tradition, especially in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. So this is very important. I'm going to pause here because when you do watch the traditional Chinese kind of wedding ceremonies in the different locations in the world, you will see that early on in that video, it talks about cultural evolution and that it was just like this promiscuous horde that was just breeding and kind of not having marriage structures. This is based on some of Morgan's and early cultural evolution theories. It's basically not true. Marriage has been around for forever, at least in terms of arranged marriage and some of those other things. So even though they were matriarchal societies and it was and we were related to the people on our mother's side, that doesn't necessarily mean that there was some kind of weird, unorganized human thing going on. We've been kind of organized the way that we are traditionally for since the beginning, in terms of what we can see in the kind of archaeological record and or modern cultures living this way. The Iroquois kinship structure. So if you look at this and you start to like kind of follow it, you'll start to see that some interesting stuff happens. So what I want you to look at here is if you go up from ego and then you go to father and mother, if you go over to the left of the screen and you're looking at your father, but then you go over and you see that that your uncle, it would be called our uncle, is actually named father too. And then if you go over on your mom's side and you see your aunt, who is also a sibling of your mom, would actually be called mom. Now, the terminology here is important because if you call more than one person father or mother, those people are going to be closer to you, and you're going to have those people to trust. So, similarly, so what's fascinating too is if you look at your ego, even though this is represented by a triangle, it's basically saying that the ego is a male, but you see that the ego has a sister. Now, if you go over in that same line, that the group right next to you, you're going to call that whole cousin group, that would be called a cousin group because it was your aunt of your sister of your mother and your brother of your father. Those individuals are going to be called brother and sister. Now, when you get outside of that, when you get inside of the kind of the outside and into the marriage aspect of things, what you end up having is cousins. So you have a bunch of brothers and sisters that in our terminology would be cousins, but in the Iroquois kinship structure, which is what Morgan studied, would definitely be brothers and sisters, giving you again more kind of close-knit kinship and relations with family. The Hawaiian kinship is fascinating as well. Again, if we look at ego and we go up and we see father, mother, what we end up seeing is father, mother throughout. So this is increasing even more. Now, with the Hawaiian kinship structure, there's been a lot of kind of talk about it when anthropologists went in and discussed it. What it does is it literally creates a community of micro family or micro cultures, which is what I talked about, right? Our nuclear family is usually our mom, dad, sisters, and brother. In this case, what you have here is a bunch of sisters and brothers, and also moms and dads. The whole generation that is related to you would be mother and father, to the point where you wouldn't even. People say, "Yeah, but come on, you know who your mom and dad are." But no, really, what it is you may spend more time with your real mom and dad in terms of your biological, but those other people, you may spend the night in their hut as well. They are mom and dad, and they are trusted like mom and dad. We're not making like side names with little asterisks, and that's not what kinship is. This is literally your aunt and uncle are also your father and mother, and they act as your father and mother. So what it creates is, again, not only for you as the ego, much more trustworthy kind of group of people that you can talk to with your own problems, your individual issues, but it also is a enculturation process. Remember, even in our society, like people get a little bit taken aback when maybe an aunt and uncle want to discipline your child, or relatives kind of step in for discipline or conversations. In this situation, that term, it takes a village. This is a lot of what this looks like. Mom and dad that are in the other hut can discipline your child just like you would, because they're mom and dad. So this is a very different structure than what we're used to, but it is much more community driven. It is much more together. It's less about individuality, and it's much more about having a cohesive family group. So when we talk about the function of kinship, and we're looking at social cohesion, this is a perfect example of what does that provide. Of what does calling my aunt and uncle mom and dad and them living in the same village actually provide me? What is the function of that? And these are the huge questions in terms of kinship. So this would be a kinship map. So what's fascinating about this is like a village site, and this is where the huts would be, and this is where people would basically live. An anthropologist would map these structures out in terms of the village and where it was kind of laid out in the village, and these are what the dotted lines pretty much look like. So it's the extended family universe. But yeah, so you could even do kind of on a grid system, 6, 4A, these kinds of things. This is like marking off where the spots are and where people actually live in the village. So quite fascinating in terms of kinship mapping. Matrilineal descent is what this looks like. Remember, matrilineal descent is unilineal descent. You only call people in your mother's line they're your only relatives. You move away from your father once he marries into the mom side of the family. They move towards mom's side of the family. You stop even having real relations with the father's side, maybe except for some ceremonies here and there, but it's not it's not something that you call relatives. Same is true for patrilineal descent. You only have unilineal descent. You're not actually claiming the other side of the family in terms of descent structure. Bilateral descent. Again, this is our structure where we call people on both sides. We call them aunt, uncle, cousins, niece, nephew. This is bilateral descent. So you still and a lot of groups have this as well. So we have a lot of matrilineal groups, patrilineal groups, bilateral groups. So again, fascinating kind of breakout in terms of human kind of structure around kinship and its importance. So some of the things that we need to talk about in terms of locality. Matrilocal, again, means you move with the wife or your mom's side of the family. Patrilocal means you move with your father's side or the dad's side, the male side. Neolocal is what we have in America, which means we don't necessarily live next to any of our family. We don't have to. We could. I've actually done both, where I've come back and lived with my family and my wife's family. So we've done matrilocal, patrilocal, and now we're neolocal. So in the United States, we tend to be kind of everywhere in terms of residency. And in the next video session, I'll start to talk about some of these bullet points here.